A rarely talked about phenomenon in paranormal circles, or at least one that doesn't get much attention, is that of the wrong rooms. There are various stories that exist of people getting lost in the corridors or hallways of rather mundane places like hospitals or museums, and stumbling upon strange, out-of-place rooms containing things they were never meant to see. Here are some of these stories. In July 1964, Mrs. CK admitted her almost 2-year-old son to the children's ward in the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Hospital for a pediatric examination, while her husband, an Air Force serviceman stationed at the base, was away on duty. While they were waiting in the lounge, Mrs. CK's child wouldn't stop fidgeting in his seat and rushed down the corridor, squeezing through a swinging door into a room marked Isolation, Keep Out. Mrs. CK rushed after him and opened the door. Inside the door, on a bed, without sheets or pillows, was a torso-like mass of flesh, which she described as looking like an uncooked pot roast, without arms or legs. The mass of flesh had a crease down the middle, with tubes inserted at each end, connected to an apparatus holding a clear fluid. Mrs. CK was horrified by this sight. As her child kept tugging at her to get away, a nurse bolted into the room and harshly advised them to leave. While back at the lounge, Mrs. CK saw lots of activity outside the room, but couldn't hear what was being said. The next day, they both returned for another appointment. Mrs. CK found the nurse and apologized to her for the trouble her son had caused the day prior. She was surprised to find that the nurse was friendlier this time around. She was even more surprised when the nurse ushered her into the room, now without the isolation sign, which now looked like any other room of the hospital. The nurse didn't say anything about the thing in the room the day prior, and Mrs. CK was too afraid to ask. In 1965, RM was visiting an Air Force museum in Fairborn, Ohio with his wife. While his wife was examining a rocket on display, he had wandered off and gone down a corridor. He got disoriented and entered through a double door marked Off Limits. RM came face to face with a being dressed like an astronaut, in a silver suit with a support pack and a translucent dome over a large head. The being wasn't human, said RM. According to him, its eyes were large under a heavy brow. It had no nose and only a slit for a mouth. The being's skin was bluish, or at least that's how it looked through the dome. When the creature walked, it shuffled forward without bending its knees. At one point during their encounter, the creature held out both arms mechanically, pointing its long elongated fingers towards him. The alarm system suddenly sounded, and an emergency evacuation was announced on the speakers. RM managed to find an exit, and claims that the cause for evacuation was most definitely the creature he had stumbled upon. At around 1950, a Presbyterian minister and his young son visited the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The pair got lost in a labyrinth of corridors and found themselves in a room. Inside the room was a large glass case containing small humanoid bodies. The father was instantly grabbed by several men and forced to sign some papers before being allowed to leave. The son told the story to Sharon Larson of the Center of UFO Studies in 1974. A phenomenon that's almost synonymous with UFO sightings and alien encounters is that of Men in Black. Not much is known about these alleged government agents, except for the fact that they usually appear to UFO witnesses dressed in black suits and attempting to silence them in any way by either threatening or harassing them, or even resorting to assassination in some cases. While in most media the MIB are portrayed as normal human agents, encounters with them tell a different story. Most of the people who have had run-ins with the MIB describe them as humanoid freaks. They're described as being extremely tall and lacking any defining facial features. They're also described as possessing special abilities at times. Here are some of these encounters. On September 11, 1986, 58-year-old Dr. Herbert Hopkins, who was working as a consultant on a UFO case at the time, received a call. On the other end was a man who claimed to belong to a regional UFO investigative group. The man claimed to be interested in a specific UFO case, and asked if he would be able to visit Hopkins in his home office to discuss it, to which he uncharacteristically agreed. After hanging up the phone, Hopkins got up and opened the front door, and was surprised by a man heading up his walkway. The man was dressed in a black suit, dark gray gloves, and a bowler-style hat. Hopkins was startled by the fact that the man appeared so quickly, considering how there were no phone booths around, and how he didn't seem to get out of any car. It would be impossible for the man to have reached his house this quickly, even with a car. The stranger then sat down with Hopkins, and they began discussing the case. At one point, the man brushed his mouth with the back of his glove, leaving a red lipstick mark on it. The man appeared to have no lips, only a thin slit. The lipstick seemed to have been worn to give the illusion of having lips. At one point during the conversation, the man told Hopkins, whose hand was in his pocket, that there were 2 coins in it. Hopkins confirmed that fact. The man then asked him to take one of the coins out of his pocket, hold it in the palm of his hand, and watch closely. As Hopkins watched the coin, he saw it going out of focus until it ultimately disappeared. "Neither you nor anyone else on this plane will ever see that coin again," the man then told him, before asking him if he was familiar with alleged UFO abductee Barney Hill. Hopkins told him that he was, and that he had died not too long ago. The man told Hopkins that he was correct, but he added, "Barney didn't have a heart, just like you no longer have a coin." The man then told Hopkins to destroy any material pertaining to the UFO case he'd been working on, before leaving. A former postal delivery person in Washington, D.C., tells the story of his encounter with bizarre-looking men in black. The delivery person had gone to a huge building to deliver some mail. He was told by security that the entire premises was under video surveillance, and he noticed that security was unusually tight. When he went to deposit the mail, only the mailroom would be open to him, while the rest of the building was inaccessible. He was only allowed to deposit the mail and leave. A few weeks later, while delivering mail to the same building, the man saw 3 figures crossing the street. At first glance, they looked normal, but as he got closer, he noticed that they were extremely thin, and they didn't walk by putting one leg in front of the other, but instead waddled by moving their whole bodies side to side, as he described it. What frightened him, though, was how thin they were. They were as flat as a set of clothes that had been ironed. Their entire faces and bodies were flat. Not even their noses protruded from their faces. All 3 were dressed in black suits, and had on black sunglasses. The 3 men in black entered the building with the delivery person following behind to deliver the mail. When he entered the room, there were 10 normal men standing there staring at him. They asked him if he had seen anything, to which he remained quiet. Then, one of the thin men from earlier walked up behind him and asked if he had seen anything. The delivery person felt intense fear and nervously replied that he hadn't, before being allowed to leave. The next week, the man's supervisor at the post office informed him that he had been reassigned to a new route. Reddit user JacksPrad90 made a post on the Glitch in the Matrix subreddit, titled, "Could time travel be a natural phenomenon? My experience in Washington's Cascade Mountains." Jack was born in the western Washington Cascades. As a kid, him and his father spent a lot of time exploring the mountains, fishing and hunting. One part of the Cascades which Jack claimed to know like the back of his hand was Goblin's Creek. As a kid, Jack and his dad would drive up there to do some fishing and shooting. They would also collect a rock which, when cut in half and polished, would resemble a scenic picture of the view of the mountains from within the cave. They called them picture rocks. They would collect these rocks and sell them at their neighbor's mineral shop. The walk from the creek where they harvested these rocks to the dirt road wasn't particularly long, but rather lengthy enough that you could get lost if you didn't know where to go. During the years they spent there, they'd only ever met 2 people at this creek. The first was a game warden who had heard their target practice gunshots and came to check on them. The second is the subject of this story. When Jack was about 14, he distinctly remembers hauling a backpack full of these rocks up the creek to his dad's truck. Along the way, he ran into a man who looked to be about 30. They both appeared to be surprised to have run into someone in this remote section of the mountains. The 30-year-old man grew increasingly more startled as he passed by Jack, seemingly trying to figure out the appropriate words to say to him. After passing by him, Jack remembers how he thought that this guy looked like he could be a member of their family, with how similar their features were. Jack dumped off the rocks in his dad's truck and asked him if he had seen the man from earlier, to which his father said he hadn't. 15 years following this incident, while returning home to visit some family, Jack decided to head up Goblin's Creek for nostalgic purposes. He parked on the dirt road where his dad used to park and headed down the creek. As he was halfway through, he saw a boy about 14 coming up from the creek. The boy was wearing a backpack that looked to be heavy. As they got closer, Jack noticed that the boy looked exactly like he did at his age, but could not figure out the right words to say as the boy passed by him. Jack continued walking for a bit, and stopped when it hit him that he had just relived the other half of his experience. He tried to hurry back to catch up to the boy, but unfortunately there was nothing. He was simply gone.